Okay, this is Math 209, Week 2, Section 6.6. We're going to be solving quadratic equations by factoring. Alright, so when we are solving an equation by factoring, what does that mean? Well, in Desmos, if we were to take this equation, but Desmos doesn't like r as a variable, it needs x. So we're going to replace that r squared minus 7r with x squared minus 7x. And when you get this resulting beautiful parabola where the parabola crosses the x-axis at two locations, right here and right here, and when you zoom in, you see that the parabola crosses at 0 and the parabola crosses at 7. So we now automatically know that the answer is 0 and, well, I don't want to put it, r equals 0 and r equals 7. So that's, we now know the answer because Desmos gave it to us. But let's solve it algebraically. So what would that look like? Well, I need a little more space here. Okay, so what would that look like? Well, you start with r squared minus 7r equals 0, and you factor out a common term. In this case, it's r. So you end up with r times r minus 7 equals 0. So this is two numbers being multiplied by each other to equal 0. So that means either r equals 0 or r minus 7 is equal to 0. So I'm going to write that down. So either r equals 0 or r minus 7 equals 0. Well, this is done. There's no algebra to solve there. But over here, we're going to add both sides by 7. The 7's cancel. You end up with r is equal to 7. So there are our two solutions. So for this equation to equal 0, either r has to equal 0 or r is equal to 7. So here we can, if we have a choice, we could change those t's to x's. Oops, there, x equals 0. And then we can take this and we can graph this into Desmos, and that would give us our answer because, of course, Desmos doesn't like t. It wants the variables to be x. But if we wanted to, we also need to learn how to do that algebraic way, right? So there's our equation. First thing we're going to do is factor out a common factor, which is t. So you take out a t and you're left with t minus 4, and that means either t or t minus 4 is equal to 0, because when you multiply these two numbers and get 0, that means one of them is a 0. So algebraically, either t equals 0 or t minus 4 equals 0. No algebra to solve here. T is equal to 0. But over here, we have some algebra. We can add 4 to both sides. So the 4's cancel. That leaves t is equal to 4. So there are our two solutions. So again, we could use Desmos and change this to x squared minus 9 and graph it, and we would get the answer. But let's do it with algebra. So we've got t squared minus 9 is equal to 0. We have no common factors to factor out, so we're going to go straight to the box. And the box says, well, you put the t squared right there, you put the negative 9 there, and you recognize that these are squares. T times t gives us t squared. 3 times 3 gives us 9. We're going to ignore the sign for a second, which means in these internal terms we get 3t and 3t. But we have no t's over here. We just have a t squared. And that's because these 3t's must have to cancel out. That means this must be a negative 3t and this has to be a positive 3t, which makes this a negative 3 and makes this a positive 3. And so now we've got our factor. So we've got t plus 3 times t minus 3 equals 0. All right. So what does that say? Well, that says this number times this number has to equal 0. So that means either t plus 3 equals 0 or t minus 3 equals 0. So doing our little algebra, we're going to subtract both sides by 3 and the 3's cancel. You get t is equal to negative 3, or over here we're going to add both sides by 3. The 3's cancel. So you get t is equal to positive 3, and there are your two solutions. So here we're going to factor out our common term, which happens to be 4. So I'm going to factor that out, and I get 4n squared minus 1 is equal to 0. And this, we're going to use the box. And we got 4n squared, and we've got negative 1. And I want us to recognize these are both squares. So that's 2n times 2n. And this is 1 times 1, ignoring the signs temporarily. So our internal terms must be 2n and 2n, but we don't have any internal terms over here. So that means these guys must cancel. That's got to be negative, that's got to be positive, which makes this negative, makes this positive. So you end up with 4 times 2n plus 1 times 2n minus 1 equals 0. All right. So we've got 3 numbers being multiplied. We've got 4 times 2n plus 1 times 2n minus 1, and that all equals 0. So one of these has to equal 0 in order for the answer to be 0. Well, 4 definitely cannot be 0 because 4 is 4. So that means either 2n plus 1 is equal to 0 or 2n minus 1 is equal to 0. So now we're going to use our algebra to solve both of these equations. So we're going to subtract by 1. The 1's cancel. So you end up with 2n is equal to negative 1. And we're going to divide by 2. The 2's cancel. So you end up with n is equal to negative 1/2. There's one possible solution. And then over here, kind of the same. We're going to add 1 to both sides. The 1's cancel. So you end up with 2n is equal to 1. Then you're going to divide both sides by 2. So the 2's cancel. So you end up with n is equal to 1/2. So there are our two possible solutions. So here, this is just a big exercise in factoring. So we've got b squared plus 14b plus 48, and that equals 0. So we're going to do our box. We have no common factors, so that means we know that b squared is going to go here. Positive 48 is going to go here. Makes that b times b. And then we have to think about all the combinations that equal 48. So let's see, 48. Well, that's 1 times 48, 2 times 24, 3 times 116, 4 times 12, 6 times 8, and there, hey, look at that. There is the only combination that can either add or subtract to give us 14. So that means we know that one of these is going to be a 6 and one of these is going to be an 8. And so when we do the math, you get 6b, you get 8b, and because we want the answer, the internal terms, to be 14b, that means we want both of these to be positives, which makes this positive 8 and positive 6. And so our factored form becomes, and I'm going to zoom down here, and I'm going to actually drag, oops, I can't drag that, which means this factored form ends up being b plus 8 times b plus 6 equals 0. So that means either b plus 8 equals 0 or b plus 6 equals 0. So subtracting both sides by 8, the 8's cancel, you get b is equal to negative 8. And then over here, subtracting both sides by 6, the 6's cancel, and you get b is equal to negative 6. And there are your two possible answers. All right, so we've got just another exercise in factoring. So you got x squared minus 12x plus 20 equals 0. And what we're going to do is we're going to factor this, and we see no common factors, so immediately we know we can go straight to the box. And we know that x squared goes here, positive 20 goes here, and we're going to use logic to fill in our outside, which is x times x. Now if we're going to think about 20 can be 1 times 20, 2 times 10, 4 times 5, and since we know we want our internal numbers to be 12, the only way any one of these three combinations can equal 12 is this guy right here. So we know we're going to use 2 and 10, and so now we can fill in our internal terms. So you get 2x and 10x, and these two we want to be negative 12, so that means both of them have to be negative, which makes this negative 10 and that a negative 2. So our factoring, so I'm going to bring this guy down. So factoring, we end up with x minus 10 times x minus 2, and that equals 0. So either x minus 10 equals 0 or x minus 2 equals 0. So adding 10 to both sides, the 10's cancel. You get x is equal to 10. And then over here, adding by 2, so the 2's cancel, so you get x is equal to 2. And that are your two solutions. So for this one, first off, one of the things we could do is we could replace the d's with x's and then use Desmos to graph. But we're going to do the algebra because it's going to turn out that the answer is a fraction, and Desmos doesn't play nice with fractions. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to factor. And we see no common term, so we're going to move over to the box method. And the box, we know that 2d squared goes there. We know that negative 2 goes there. And so it's pretty straightforward here. It's going to be 2d times d. That's how we're going to get 2d squared. Now the 2, and I'm ignoring the fact that it's a negative right now. The 2. Well, we have a choice, because once you set this, I want you to set it and forget it. Don't move that around. The only thing you're going to move around is the factors that make 2. Because we know we could put the 1 up at the top and the 2 down here. or we can reverse it and put the 2 at the top and the 1 down here. So we have a choice, and it's just a guess. It really is just a guess. So you start with a guess, and you multiply to see if it works. So that right there must be a 4D, and this must be a 1D. And now you start looking at this middle term, and this middle term is a positive 3D. So is there a way I can use these two numbers to get positive 3D? And the answer is yes. If this is a positive 4D and this is a negative 1D, that gives me the 3D that I'm looking for, which makes this a negative 1, makes this a positive 2. And so our factors are 2D minus 1 times D plus 2 equals 0. So that means either 2D minus 1 is equal to 0 or D plus 2 equals 0. So we're going to add 1 to both sides. So you get 2D equals 1. And now we're going to divide both sides by 2, so the 2's cancel, and we get D is equal to 1/2. So that's part of our problem, and that shows why we couldn't use Desmos, because the answer is a fraction. And again, Desmos doesn't play nice with fractions. So we're going to go over here and solve this one. So we're going to subtract both sides by 2. The 2's cancel, so that gives us D is equal to negative 2. And we are officially done. So there's a couple ways to solve this. One, we could use logic, and we just know x squared. You could say, well, x squared equals 100. So that means, well, you could either do 10 times 10 equals 100, or you could do negative 10 times negative 10 equals 100. So we are officially done because those are your two options. So the answer is either 10 or negative 10 because they both give you 100. All right, so that's the one way. But really what they want us to do for my math lab is to start by using algebra. So we're going to start by saying, well, we need it to equal 0. And this doesn't equal 0. So we need to get rid of that 100 and move it over to the other side. So we're going to subtract both sides by 100. And so that gives me x squared minus 100 equals 0. So this is now in the format that we need in order to solve the algebraic equation. So we're going to draw our box. We know x squared goes here. We know negative 100 goes here. So we've got x times x. We've got 10 times 10. And since we have no middle term in our trinomial here, it's just a binomial, that means 10x and 10x, they have to cancel each other out. That makes this a positive 10 and a negative 10. So this equation factors to x plus 10 times x minus 10, which equals 0. So that tells us here that either x plus 10 equals 0 or x minus 10 equals 0. So I'm going to just, well, no, let's do it. Subtract both sides by 10, so the 10's cancel. So you get x is equal to negative 10. Over here, we're going to add 10 to both sides. The 10's cancel. So you get x is equal to positive 10. So there are our two solutions. Either x is equal to negative 10 or x is equal to positive 10. And we knew that all along up here, just using plain old logic. All right, so we begin by noticing that we do have a 0 on the right side, so we're cool there. So we've got c squared minus 4c is equal to 0, but I have a common factor of c. So I'm going to factor out that c, and I get c times c minus 4. So we don't really need a box over here, because we see that either c equals 0 or c minus 4 equals 0. Oopsies. All right, well, c equals 0 is done. There's no algebra for us to solve there. But over here, we need to do a little bit of algebra. We're going to add both sides by 4. So the 4's cancel. So we're left with c is equal to 4. So there are our two solutions. C is equal to 0 or c is equal to 4. And the last problem. So first thing we need to know is we don't have, the equation has to equal 0. So what we've got to do is we've got to move stuff around so that it does equal 0. So you've got x squared equals 7x plus 8. So I'm going to subtract a 7x and I'm going to subtract an 8 from both sides. All right, what does that do? These guys, the 7's cancel, 7x's cancel, the 8's cancel. So what do we end up with on the left side? We end up on the left side with x squared minus 7x minus 8 equals, and on the right side, it equals 0. All right, so there is our equation. And so now we're ready to use the box method, because there is no common factor to factor out. And so we know x squared goes here. We know negative 8 goes here. So that's x times x. And now we're going to set it and forget that part. And now we just have to do some guessing for our 8. Well, think about 8. 8 could be 1 times 8 or 2 times 4. And the only combination that's going to give us 7 is if we use 1 and 8 in some configuration. So I'm going to put the 1 up here and the 8 down here. That's a guess. And now we're going to fill in our internal terms. So we get 1x and 8x. And we know that we want these two guys to combine to equal negative 7. So that means the negative 8x and positive 1x is what we need, which makes this a negative 8, makes this a positive 1, and sure enough, if we check it out, the negative 8 times positive 1 gives us negative 8. So we have officially factored. So we've got x minus 8 times x plus 1, which is equal to 0. So that means either x minus 8 equals 0 or x plus 1 equals 0. So now we need to do a little bit of algebra on both of these. So we're going to add 8 to both sides. The 8's cancel, so you get x is equal to 8. And then over here, we're going to subtract 1 from both sides. So the 1's cancel, and you get x is equal to negative 1. And there are our two solutions.